So maybe you've been hearing about this new show called Witch from Mercury that everybody's talking about, or your friend just showed off their newest freshly painted model kit, or maybe you just saw a picture of a cool robot on Twitter or something and later learned it was from Gundam. Whatever the case may be, the robots have called to you, and now you want to get into Gundam yourself. Well, luckily for you, there's only 40 plus years of television series, movies, OVAs, manga, novels, video games, and model kits to sift through. Yeah, that's a lot, and by all standards, Gundam can seem like a pretty daunting franchise to get into, especially for newcomers. Hopefully this video will help you find a really good starting point to get you into one of my favorite multimedia franchises of all time. I do need to mention this at the top of the video, but you really can get into Gundam anywhere you want. I personally got into the franchise with G Gundam, a series that a lot of people consider to be the least Gundam-y of all the Gundam series. I got an ex-girlfriend of mine into Gundam when I took her to the theaters to see Gundam Narrative. That's probably the reason why we're exes now, but she's still into Gundam, so that's a win in my books. My point is, if you have some sort of a recommendation from a friend, or maybe you just saw a robot that you thought was cool and figured out what series it was from, you can just stop the video here and start there. For those of you who either don't have a particular series in mind or just want to know how all these shows fit together, then this video is for you. We should start off by saying that Gundam shows typically come in one of two categories, either Universal Century shows or alternate universe shows. This is referring specifically to the timeline they take place in, with a large amount of Gundam series taking place in the Universal Century, and all of the others taking place in their own separate alternate timeline. We'll start off with talking about the Universal Century, as for the first 15 years of Gundam, it was the only timeline, and as such, it's where a lot of major Gundam themes are actually cemented. So my number one recommendation when starting out with Gundam is to just start at the beginning with the original 0079 TV series. This will cover one of the Universal Century's most pivotal events, the One-Year War, and from the point of view of the first Gundam pilot. You'll follow Amuro Ray and the rest of the crew of White Base as they're thrust headfirst into this war and have to contend with the physical, emotional, and environmental toll that war has on humanity. It's worth noting that chronologically this is not the first series, and you'll see some people recommending watching Mobile Suit Gundam The Origin first, as it actually comes before, and covers the early life of anime's best deuteragonist Char Aznable, but I personally don't recommend starting with this one. As someone who often streams games by playing them entire franchises at a time, I am a huge proponent of playing things in release order. For example, if you're playing through the Metal Gear Solid games, I think it's a bit silly to start with 3 just because it comes first chronologically, and kind of ruins the ending if you've never heard the words Big Boss or Les Enfants Terribles before. This applies to the Universal Century Gundam shows as well, which luckily, chronology and release order line up a lot of the time. The most egregious example of this is The Origin though, but even the manga author of The Origin, Yasuhiko, didn't put this portion of the story until we're already 5 volumes in. The main drawback to starting with the original run of Gundam is the admittedly dated animation. It did come out in 1979. However, it's worth noting it has been reworked into 3 compilation movies to help with pacing and some animation errors in the original run. Though they weren't able to include everything, and you will miss out on some side stories like Makuve, like this guy. But at the very least, it does cover a large amount of the main story beats, and it's a great starting point if you don't want to commit to the full 43 episodes of 1979 animation. Now that you've got the context of the One-Year War in the Universal Century, it actually opens up quite a bit more. You can keep going in release order and move on to Gundam Zeta here. This series takes place 8 years after the events of the original, and you'll see how the world has changed in the aftermath of the One-Year War, as well as follow one of my favorite protagonists, Camille Bidon, as he meets foes, new friends, and familiar faces, sometimes despite their best efforts to hide it. Or you can check out some of the side stories that revolve around the One-Year War, like 0080 War in the Pocket, which follows the story of a 10-year-old boy living on a neutral space colony and finds himself making friends with both Zeon and Federation soldiers while smack in the middle of a conflict between the two. Or there's 8th Mobile Suit Team, which is about Shiro Amada, who's the new commander of the titular 8th Mobile Suit Team, who is currently engaged in a guerrilla battle for resources with Zeon in Southeast Asia. This story follows the unit and focuses a lot on the bonds that can be created between soldiers. At this point, the Universal Century really is your oyster, though a lot of people consider the original run, Gundam Zeta and Char's Counterattack, to be this huge main essential core, and I kind of agree with that. It's also worth noting there are some Universal Century shows or movies like F91 or Victory that are actually set so far out from that main Universal Century block that they can be watched entirely standalone. There is one other very good option, and that is Gundam Thunderbolt. Now, while this does technically take place during the One-Year War, it doesn't require very much context of it, as it mostly just uses it as a setting. This is my #1 recommendation to folks who don't want to take the entire Universal Century plunge, as it is just 2 movies or a very good manga, and it sports some absolutely gorgeous animation and one of the best soundtracks in the entire franchise. It also keeps a ton of the major themes from Gundam, so you can get an idea what the show and the franchise is all about without committing tens of hours to a series. The other option, if the Universal Century seems too daunting, dated, or just not your cup of tea, is to jump into one of Gundam's many alternate universe shows, which each typically have their own timeline. As such, they can all serve as their own separate jumping on point for the franchise. As I mentioned earlier, Mobile Fighter G Gundam was my first Gundam show, and then I continued watching AUs with Wing and 00 before I ever jumped into any Universal Century content. I won't be going over every AU here, as they each have their own merits, but I'll try to talk about some that I think are notable, for better or worse.
Let's get things started! Gundam fight all set, ready, go!
First up, I'd like to talk about Mobile Fighter G Gundam, often heralded as the Street Fighter of Gundam. While the Gundam shows up to this point are mostly fairly grounded and have only lightly dabbled in super abilities in the form of new types, this show leans into it way more heavily, with all of the characters able to make their mobile suits do incredible feats and attacks, largely thanks to the mobile trace system the show uses, infamous for its rather compelling suit-up sequences. In lieu of a normal cockpit with switches and knobs and levers, the system simply takes the pilot's movements and applies them directly to the mobile suit. On its face value, the show seems to take any sort of realism way less seriously than its Universal Century predecessors. It still boasts some themes consistent in Gundam, like the environmental and human cost of war, the atrocities one can commit for power, and the strength of humans' bonds. It's an absolute favorite of mine, but as this is a guide for new watchers, I do have to reiterate the presentation differs quite heavily from more traditional Gundam shows. Another popular entry, especially in the West, thanks to Toonami, is Gundam Wing. This is probably the Gundam series most people my age are familiar with if they haven't already delved into Gundam, and the mobile suit designs are some of the most striking and creative in the entire franchise. This series has unfortunately soured a little bit in my eyes with the passage of time, with a muddled political landscape and hard to glean character motivations making the story a bit hard to follow. It still is the entry that got a large amount of people into the franchise, and I think that's worth something. One recommendation I might get a little bit of flack for is Iron-Blooded Orphans. This series forgoes the beam weaponry that's common in the Gundam franchise for a much more ballistic-focused combat. And while Gundam has always been fairly dark with some of its themes, this series plays heavily on the naive children being taken advantage of for being too ambitious, in a way that can come off as incredibly bleak when the story really gets going. It has a generally well-regarded first season and an incredibly divisive second season that I personally love, but some vehemently hate. In any case, it boasts some really impressive mobile suit designs and the animation is just a treat to watch. Probably the most notable AU entry at the time of this recording is the currently airing Witch from Mercury. The show is currently only on episode 16 as I write this, but has been incredibly popular up to this point. I'll hesitate to say too much due to either spoiler reasons or turning out to be wrong in the chance of a later plot twist, but the show is incredibly intriguing currently, with the nice school setting that pervades the first part of the show starting to crack under the seams of different political pressures. It also has our first female protagonist, Pilot, in a Gundam show, which has been an absolute treat. If you'd like something just a little more lighthearted or are really into the Gundam plastic model kits, you could always check out the Gundam Build series. Under the Gundam Build umbrella, there's Gundam Build Fighters and Gundam Build Divers, which are separate but each have a sequel series as well. Think of these as something a little more akin to a Saturday morning cartoon, and if it's your first series, while you'll probably miss some of the cameo shots from the various Gundam characters that appear throughout the shows, it's still the best place to see some model kit fighting action. Speaking of, while this video is largely about the animated Gundam media, it feels like a huge disservice to not talk about the model kits, especially as there's quite a few fans that just build these and have never watched Gundam in their lives. Gundam plastic models, or Gunpla for short, are model kits based on the mobile suits from all the various shows. These also double as a way to slowly siphon our money into Bandai's hands without us even noticing. That's mostly a joke, and while a lot of people can spend a lot of money on this hobby, it doesn't have to be that expensive, especially as a beginner. To cover the basics, most Gunpla kits are categorized into grades, which denote the size and complexity. The basic grades are high grade, master grade, and perfect grade, which increase in price, size, and complexity in that order. There are other popular grades like the real grade, which is the same size as a high grade but much more complex. And recently, in Perfect for Beginners, Bandai has rebooted the entry grade line, which are very similar to high grades, but they don't require nippers, which you normally need for Gunpla kits. Speaking of tools, there's a lot I could talk about there, but most of my model kits are just built with nippers and some sandpaper, although there are a ton of other optional tools you could use. However, instead of me talking about it, there are a ton of really wonderful people in the Gunpla community who have made a slew of beginner-friendly tutorial videos, and I suggest you check those out instead. They'll do a much better job explaining all this Gunpla stuff than I will, shoehorning it into the end of this video. And if you're a Discord user, you can pop into my stream sometime and type !Discord and come talk to some of the Gunpla builders there. There's a lot of really talented people who have already helped others get started on their model building journeys. And with that, we've made it to the end of the video. I do want to reiterate here that there's not really a wrong answer on where to start your Gundam journey. I've met people that have started from pretty much every Gundam series I can think of, except for maybe Igloo. I don't know anyone who stuck around after watching that first, but if you have, let me know. In any case, I hope this video helps you figure out how these 40 plus years of Gundam actually all fit together, and maybe figure out where some of the more ideal starting places might be. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the video, and check my socials down in the description for even more content.